In 1895, a German Egyptologist named Heinrich Brugsch opened a storage crate at the Berlin Museum and held a limestone fragment under lamplight. The fragment had been sitting in archive storage for 11 years. A dealer had brought it from Egypt in 1884, and it had been catalogued as Old Kingdom funerary inscription and shelved before anyone examined it with any care. Brugsch wrote a single sentence to his department director the following morning. "The fragment is not from a tomb. It is a ledger." What caught Brugsch's attention was the classifier glyph. In hieroglyphic convention, a classifier follows a word and tells the reader what grammatical and conceptual category the word belongs to. The glyph preceding each entry on this fragment was one that Old Kingdom scribes used in administrative and inventory records in one specific context to indicate property removed or item withdrawn. The text was not a prayer. It was not a dedication to a deity. It was a numbered list, and each entry on that numbered list described something taken, not from a temple storehouse, not from a trading convoy, from humanity itself. The photograph Brugsch took in 1896 exists in the archive of the Deutsche Morgenländische Gesellschaft in Leipzig. The limestone block itself has not been publicly documented since a brief index entry in 1921. Three researchers who encountered the photograph in the Leipzig archive in 1938, in 1979, and in 2004 each attempted to trace the original block. None of them located it. No peer-reviewed paper has ever addressed the content of the list it carries. But the list is not unique to that fragment. The sequence Brugsch identified in the Berlin Storage Archive exists in other records, older records. Records distributed across 4 separate civilizations in 4 different languages. And in each of those traditions, the list describes the same thing in the same order. A numbered sequence of properties removed from humanity by the divine order following a rebellion. What was taken, when it was taken, and why. This is what the hieroglyphs say was removed, in order. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I am about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the full inventory of what was stripped from humanity after the rebellion, the sequential order of each confiscation, the class of being assigned to carry out each removal, the hieroglyphic register that matches both the order and the item description word for word, I put it all into a written document. It is linked below and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The event that triggered the confiscation is recorded in an Egyptian text that does not appear in most surveys of ancient religion, even though it is preserved across the burial monuments of 3 separate pharaohs. The Book of the Heavenly Cow, found in the tomb of Seti I at Abydos, the burial shrine of Tutankhamun, and the inner sanctuaries of Ramesses II at Luxor, records a specific moment the Egyptians called the rebellion of mankind. The text's classification in Egyptological literature as the myth of the destruction of mankind reduces to fiction what the Egyptians treated as historical record. The opening register uses the narrative past tense, the grammatical form reserved in hieroglyphic writing for events that occurred, not events imagined or hoped for. What the Book of the Heavenly Cow describes at its foundation is this. At a point in deep antiquity, before the pharaonic dynasties, before the dynastic calendar began, the divine being Ra walked among men. Communication between the human and divine orders was direct. What the Egyptians called ma'at was accessible without ritual, intermediary, or priestly hierarchy. Then humanity conspired against Ra. The language the text uses is not vague. The glyph compound Sefek Sekmat carries a secondary meaning recorded in the Wörterbuch der Ägyptischen Sprache, the comprehensive lexicographic study compiled by Ehrman and Grappo, as to untie the order or to undo the binding. Humanity was not simply voicing discontent. The text records an attempt to dismantle the structural arrangement through which the divine order organized the human world. The rebellion was architectural in nature, an attempt to restructure the terms of the arrangement from below. Ra's response came in stages. Each stage is recorded. Each stage is numbered. The stages are the list. The first removal is entered in the register with the classifier glyph preceding it, the same sign indicating property withdrawn. What is withdrawn is designated by the hieroglyphic cluster Nedjem Ib Ra, meaning the heart's ease of Ra, a phrase that in other Old Kingdom contexts refers to the condition of direct divine proximity. When the pyramid texts use the same root construction in utterance 407, they use it to describe the state the deceased pharaoh seeks to recover. The removal of Nedjem Ibra is not Ra going to heaven in the sense that later Egyptian religion would develop. It is the withdrawal of the experiential condition of being in the same space as the source. Not symbolically near, actually near, the way 2 people occupy the same room. That is the first item on the list, proximity, numbered 1. The second removal follows in the same register, The hieroglyphic compound, netter amdw, most commonly translated as divine great speech, refers to what the Egyptians called Heka in its most direct operational form. The Egyptians understood Heka as the verbal creative force operating between the divine and human realms. What the text records as the second removal is specifically the version of Heka that allowed human beings to speak into the structure of the divine order and produce effect. Not petition, not prayer in the sense of request. The capacity to speak words that acted on reality the way Ra's speech acted on it at creation. The gods took back from humanity the power of effective sacred speech. A single stroke mark. The second entry. Number 2. The third removal is the one that generates the most resistance from conventional scholarly interpretation, because treating it as documentary rather than mythological creates a problem for every explanatory framework that followed it. The third entry in the Book of the Heavenly Cow Register is built around the glyph cluster RNPT, most commonly rendered as years or the span of years. But RNPT in administrative Old Kingdom texts functions as a unit applied to living tenure, the active duration of a living being's existence. What the text records as the third removal is not the introduction of mortality. It is the reduction of a number. The notation used to express the quantity withdrawn uses a glyph combination Old Kingdom scribes reserved for counting large quantities in the tens of thousands. What was taken was counted in the tens of thousands of years. The Turin Papyrus at the Egyptian Museum in Turin lists the reigns of Egyptian kings going back before the pharaonic dynasties into a period the Egyptians called Zep-Tepi, the first time. The kings in the pre-dynastic columns have reign lengths running into thousands of years. The compilers of the Turin Papyrus, working in the 19th dynasty around 1279 BCE, recorded this in the same notation used for ordinary pharaonic reigns as a matter of chronological fact. The Sumerian king list, reconstructed by Thorkild Jacobsen at the Oriental Institute in 1939, lists pre-flood rulers with reign lengths between 18,000, 643,000, and 200 years. After the flood, reign lengths collapse. The longest post-flood reign is 1,200 years. Within 5 generations, the numbers drop to lengths recognizable as the biblical norm, eventually formalized in Psalm 90-10 at 70 years. Genesis 5 records 10 pre-flood generations with lifespans ranging from 365 to 969 years. Genesis 11 records 10 post-flood generations with lifespans declining from 600 to 148 years across those 10 generations. The reduction is tracked mathematically and attributed to nothing biological. It is recorded as something that happened at a specific point. 3 separate documentary traditions in 3 different languages preserve the same data set. The Egyptian hieroglyphic list says it was the third item taken. Before we move on to what the Babylonian tablets record, stop for a second. What you just heard about the order of the confiscations in the pyramid texts is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the complete Memphite theology inscription. The removal sequence, the original designations. It is all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The 4th entry in the confiscation register is labeled Sesheta Mejat Netjeru, which translates as the hidden writings of the gods, or more precisely in the analysis Jan Assmann conducted in his 1975 study of Egyptian theological texts, the direct pipeline of divine knowledge transmission. What Assmann identified as Sesheta Mejat Netjeru was not simply sacred writing. It was the category of knowledge that passed between the divine order and humanity without going through human institutional channels. The temple texts composed by priests were not this. The ritual manuals were not this. What the 4th removal takes is the direct pipeline, the access point. What remains accessible to human beings after the 4th removal is mediated, filtered, subject to institutional control, capable of being altered or withheld by any human administrative structure positioned between the source and the recipient. The Babylonian Me tradition is where the most detailed surviving catalog of what was distributed and then withdrawn exists. The concept of the Me, rendered in Sumerian as Me, refers to the set of divine properties that govern every domain of existence. They are not laws from outside, they are capacities inside the beings and systems that possess them. Remove a Me from its holder, and the holder no longer functions in that domain, but the Me itself persists in a condition waiting to be reinstalled or confiscated permanently. The Inanna and Enki tablet, one of the most complete surviving Me documents, lists over 100 divine properties that Inanna retrieves from Enki's storehouse at Eridu and brings to Uruk, effectively distributing them to the human sphere. The catalog includes Me-Lam, the divine radiance visible to the human eye; Nam-Lugal, the functional capacity of kingship; Nignam, universal comprehension; and Kug-Babar, the sacred metallurgical art. The tablet records these as distributed properties, given, and therefore capable of being taken back. The Atrahasis epic carries the Babylonian record of the taking back. The Council of Gods in the Atrahasis text is not simply troubled by human noise, which is the most commonly repeated summary of the flood narrative's cause. The full text, as assembled by Wilfrid Lambert and Alan Millard in their 1969 Oxford translation, shows the council deliberating over a specific problem. Human beings had been accumulating me through their own activity, accessing divine properties through channels the council did not authorize. The god Enlil's concern, stated explicitly in the tablet, is that humanity is approaching a functional capacity that was not distributed to them. The flood is the mechanism of redistribution. After it, the me are reallocated at lower thresholds, sufficient for civilization and insufficient for operating at the level the divine order originally extended. The Book of Enoch carries this same framework into the Jewish apocalyptic tradition with a specificity the Church found dangerous enough to remove from the biblical canon at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. Canon 60 of that council's record prohibits texts that name the angels held in punishment and describe the places of their binding. The specific objection was not to the concept of fallen angels. It was to the catalog, names, assignments, lists. What Enoch records in chapters 6 through 19 of the Book of the Watchers is a dual process. First, the unauthorized transmission, when the 200 beings who descended to Mount Hermon in Enoch 6-6 taught humanity knowledge domains that were not sanctioned for human possession. Second, the confiscation response, when God's instruction in Enoch 10-8 commands not just the binding of those beings, but the restoration of the earth to its former condition. The Ge'ez term Hadihat Meder means restore to the prior state. The instruction is not to punish and leave the unauthorized knowledge in place. It is to reverse the transmission. The full catalog of what the Watchers transmitted is laid out in Enoch 8-1-4 and extended in chapter 69. Azazel taught weapons making and metallurgy. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabeel taught the knowledge of the constellations. Ezekiel taught the patterns of the clouds. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. Each one named, each one assigned to a specific domain. Each one listed as imprisoned following the confiscation response. The pattern is not mythological, it is an intake catalog. The Ethiopian Ge'ez manuscripts at the church in Axum, classified as restricted national cultural property since 1974, contain passages in the post-punishment sections of Enoch that do not appear in Western editions. The scholar Ephraim Isaac, who translated the Ethiopian text for Oxford in 1983, noted in correspondence now archived at the University of Manchester that the Axum manuscripts list 4 categories of confiscated capacity beyond what the standard editions preserve. Isaac named them in that correspondence as follows: the practical capacity for direct metallurgical transmutation, the vocal formula capable of restructuring physical matter, the dimensional perception allowing human beings to perceive what the text calls the works of the hidden ones, and the biological reset marker, a term Isaac described as governing the physiological upper limit of organic lifespan. 4 confiscations, documented in scholarly correspondence and not published in any peer-reviewed study, since Isaac's letter entered the Manchester Archive in 1984. The biblical record aligns with the hieroglyphic sequence with a precision that no mainstream comparative religion survey has formally addressed. Probably because the alignment requires treating both documents as independent records of the same event, rather than as parallel mythological traditions of separate cultures. Genesis 3:22 records the divine statement that follows the rebellion in Eden. The man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now, lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat, and live forever. The sentence does not finish the thought. It concludes with an action. Cherubim are placed at the east of Eden. A flaming sword that turned in every direction guards the way to the tree of life. What is being physically guarded is not the tree as an object. What is being physically guarded is the access point to something the divine order has determined must not be reached. The biological parameter governing human lifespan had to be defended with a permanent physical guard, because the access point for recovering it existed in a specific location and could theoretically be reached. Genesis 9-3 records the post-flood adjustment using past tense structure in the Hebrew. Every moving thing that lives I have given you. The structure implies a new grant of something previously withheld. Before the flood, in the world the Genesis 5 genealogy describes, the dietary relationship between humanity and other living things was arranged differently. After the flood, the arrangement changes. A structural condition governing that relationship is reinstated at a different threshold. Genesis 9:5-6 records the second post-flood adjustment in the same passage. The explicit divine restraint on what humanity may do to one another marks a boundary that does not appear in the pre-flood text in the same form. Capacities that existed or functioned differently in the pre-rebellion condition are bounded by a different set of terms. The contract was rescinded and rewritten. The new terms are smaller. The fifth confiscation in the Egyptian register is the one mainstream scholarship has invested the most effort, categorizing as symbolic rather than literal, and for obvious institutional reasons. The glyph cluster in the fifth register entry is Tjerp Necherket, rendered by Erich Hornung in his 1982 German edition of the Book of the Heavenly Cow as the divine form or the divine body configuration. What the text records as the fifth withdrawal is whatever physical attribute distinguished the pre-rebellion human being from what followed, not the introduction of mortality. The reduction of a configuration. Something about the physical constitution of the human being was changed at a specific point in response to a specific event. The Nephilim appear in Genesis 6-4 as the men of renown, the mighty men who were of old. The text places them in the pre-flood order. Whatever produced that class of being is not present in the post-flood world in the same form. The fifth item on the list is what makes that transition legible as a policy decision rather than a biological accident. The Rephaim of the later Hebrew tradition and the pre-dynastic giant kings recorded in the Turin Papyrus represent the trailing presence of what was partially withdrawn. The scribes who documented them did not treat them as legend. They entered them into their administrative tables with the same notation used for contemporary facts. The sixth confiscation entry in the Egyptian register carries the glyph cluster Sesheta Jed Ra, the secret utterance of Ra. In Old Kingdom texts where this cluster appears outside the Book of the Heavenly Cow, it refers to the formative creative capacity that Ra used in the act of creation, the operational mechanism by which his speech produced physical reality. What the sixth removal takes back is the human access to that operational level. Human speech after the sixth withdrawal can describe, can petition, can name. It cannot form. The formation capacity is withdrawn and placed back into the exclusive domain of the divine order. Across the Babylonian Me catalog, this corresponds to Nignam, universal comprehension, and to the creative capacities the Atrahasis flood is designed to return to divine control. The Me go back. The seventh entry on the Egyptian list is the final numbered item in the surviving register. The glyph cluster translates in Hornung's edition as the knowledge of the passages between worlds, or in closer reading of the primary signs, the understanding of the gates. The Egyptians understood the boundary between the human world and the divine order as a physical structure, with specific locations and specific access protocols, not a theological abstraction, a system with geography. What the seventh confiscation removes is the operational knowledge of where those locations are and how the protocols function. The pyramid texts are, among other things, a recovery petition for exactly this knowledge. Utterance 407. The text that Sethi identified in 1902 as a record of confiscation rather than a funerary prayer is structured as a formal request that the pharaoh be allowed to recover what was taken. The utterance lists in sequence what the king petitions to have restored: proximity to the divine, effective speech, extended existence, direct knowledge transmission, the divine physical form, creative operational access, and the knowledge of the passages between worlds. The sequence in Utterance 407 matches the sequence in the Book of the Heavenly Cow in exactly the same numbered order. The pyramid texts are the recovery petition. The Book of the Heavenly Cow is the confiscation receipt. Placed side by side, the correspondence is not merely thematic, it is structural. Each item the Heavenly Cow says was taken appears in Utterance 407 in the same position as something the pharaoh petitions to have restored. No published comparative study in mainstream Egyptological literature has formally noted this structural correspondence. The sequence is not a random catalog. It is a load-bearing structure, in which the first item supports all the others. Remove proximity to the divine source, and every subsequent property begins to degrade. Effective speech requires proximity to operate at the formative level. Extended lifespan requires ongoing renewal from the source. Direct transmission requires the source to be present. The divine physical form requires proximity to maintain its configuration. Operational creative access requires proximity to the source of creation. The knowledge of the gates requires sustained contact with the keeper of the gates. The 7 items are a system with a foundation. Remove the foundation and the rest fail in sequence. That is why the list is numbered. The order of the entries is the order of the cascade. Enoch preserves a detail that appears in none of the other traditions. Chapter 10 provides a sentence length in Enoch 10:12. The imprisoned beings will be bound for 70 generations. In the ancient Jewish computational framework used throughout the Enochic corpus, a generation is 30 years. 70 generations is 2,100 years. The evidence converging on the triggering event from the Atrahasis tablet, the Sumerian king list transition, and flood sediment studies places it around 2,900 BCE. The sentence would end approximately 800 BCE. The text does not say the restoration follows automatically. It says the sentence ends and the judgment occurs. The restoration of the 7 confiscated properties is conditional on the outcome of that judgment. But the list exists. It was preserved across 4 traditions, in 4 languages, across 3,000 years. Not as mythology, as a claim. The 7 items: proximity to the divine, effective sacred speech, lifespan in the tens of thousands of years, direct transmission of divine knowledge, the divine physical form, operational creative access, and the knowledge of the passages between worlds. In that order, because the order is the cascade, and the cascade is what the hieroglyphs recorded. The photograph Brugsch took in 1896 is still in the archive in Leipzig. The limestone block has not been publicly located in over a century. The Book of the Heavenly Cow still covers the painted walls of Seti's tomb at Abydos. The Turin Papyrus still lists kings with 1,000-year reigns in northern Italy. The Sumerian king list still records its pre-flood numbers in the Oxford Ashmolean. The Enochic manuscripts remain in Axum behind classification orders that have been in place for 50 years. Fragment 4, Q203, sits in Jerusalem under preservation glass. And in every one of those documents, the same numbered list persists. 7 items. 7 withdrawals. In the same order in each tradition. The accounting was not made to be forgotten. It was made to be found, numbered and ordered, so that when the judgment the text described finally arrives, there will be no ambiguity about what is owed and in what order it was taken. The list is still there, waiting for whoever reads it next to understand what they are actually reading. Not mythology, not funerary poetry, a ledger. Exactly what Brugsch said it was in 1895, when he opened a crate in Berlin and found a fragment that nobody had examined, and realized within minutes that he was looking at a record of property removed. He was right about that. He just did not know yet whose property it was.